Over the last 2 decades, the United States has supported a range of militias, rebels, and other armed groups in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Critics have argued that such partnerships have many dangers, from enabling human rights abuses to seeding future conflicts. Policymakers, however, have sought to mitigate the risks of partnering with irregular armed groups. Militia group leaders in far-flung corners of these war-torn countries were subjected to background checks and instructed about international law and human rights, and their funding was cut when they crossed red lines. But to what extent have such measures reduced the dangers of proxy warfare? And what unforeseen consequences has this approach unleashed? In this special episode of the book series, I called the Senior Policy Advisor and Head of the Conflict Prevention and Sustaining Peace Program at the United Nations University Center for Policy Research. A new book, Illusions of Control: Dilemmas in Managing U.S. Proxy Forces in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, was published by Columbia University Press, and a copy of this book can be accessed on the link that is in the description panel of this video. Enjoy the show. Dr. Gaston, welcome to the book series.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
I want you to tell us about yourself as Dr. Erica Gaston. You are someone with a lot of jobs. I envy you for that.
Of course. So thank you for the kind introduction. And as you pointed out, I do have many hats. So I work with a UN-facing think tank. It's called the UN University Center for Policy Research. And there I lead their research on conflict prevention and sustaining peace. So everything from peacekeeping, peace building, future of peace operations, to specific issues like how climate change is affecting conflict, how youth are getting involved in peace building, or how does human rights play into some of these efforts to staunch conflict. But in addition to that, I also lecture at Columbia's Master's Program for Public Policy, CIPA, and there I teach conflict resolution. So similar topics, but a little bit more focused on the academic, a bit of a bridge of the academic to practitioner. So questions like, if you have a conflict break out, how do you get to a peace agreement or a ceasefire? What do you do to try to sustain peace if you've gotten to it? What do you do to try and create sort of structural prevention or to stop those moments from breaking out? Full range of things. And then in addition, I do have other academic projects like this book project. I'm also a non-resident fellow at the think tank called the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So what would you say is the central argument of your book?
So at its core, my book explores U.S. support to different types of militias, rebels, or other non-state armed groups in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan over the last 2 decades. So I look at a dozen different groups, and they can range from U.S. support to tens of thousands of community-based forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, to the more specialized covert paramilitary forces that might be accompanying, say, intelligence agents or U.S. special forces, to a range of Syrian rebels and militia groups that sprung up after the outbreak of the civil war there. And what I'm looking at in this book is not just this question of, did the U.S. provide support to these different types of groups, or how did they figure into the U.S. security strategy, but more specifically, how did the U.S. try to address some of the risks or consequences that come up when working with these types of groups. So many of the groups that the U.S. engaged with had a long history of war crimes, of human rights abuses, of committing atrocities. Many were part of criminal networks or might be linked to warlords. So, rather than helping the situation, they could contribute to instability. Many had direct links still with terrorist or insurgent groups. So if you imagine if the U.S. is providing some of these groups with weapons or equipment or other support, there's the risk they could pass it on, either voluntarily or under coercion. There's also the risk that those groups could go rogue themselves, attack some of the U.S. forces they're working with. Or there was a classic example of U.S. support to militias in Afghanistan in the 1980s, where some of those mujahideen supported later spun off and became al-Qaeda. So all of these different risks that could happen in working with these militia forces, and U.S. policymakers and commanders were not unaware of these risks. They knew their stuff. They knew that there were problems with these forces. But because there was a decision to work with them, they said, are there ways that we can try and address these risks? Can we put in place different types of checks or controls? So that could be like a background check to see who they're affiliated with or whether they might have committed abuses or crimes in the past. Or maybe it's providing them training on things like human rights or on codes of conduct. Maybe it's just doing certain monitoring and reporting and oversight to keep track of what they're doing, keep track of weapons they're provided or things like that, or threatening to cut them off if they engage, cross a red line or something. So all of these different types of checks and controls to try and address these risks. I look at what they tell us about some of our academic theories about proxy warfare. What do they tell us? I'm also an international lawyer in one of my hats. So what do they tell us about due diligence requirements under international law when working with these forces? And then more broadly, what do they tell us about policymaking in 21st century warfighting in these security contexts? And I say that because what's super interesting about these checks and controls, you could say, oh, they're these minor technical or tactical features, but actually they tend to get at the crux of what is problematic or controversial about these forces. They're designed to sort of moderate between some of the pros or advantages that might be seen of working with these irregular security forces, and also some of the critiques and risks of them opening up sort of this Pandora's box of other issues. And so for that reason, interrogating these risks, it's a way to explore some of the broader policy controversies and dilemmas that surround these, and also what are the compromises that happen in the policymaking space that allow these to go forward. And in particular, what I would highlight is the most interesting thing is this idea that, okay, think about if your fundamental problem is you want to work with these forces, but they pose all of these risks and problems. If you think you've got the solution to address those risks and problems, does it make it more likely that you'll support those forces? Does it make it more likely that the U.S. would work with these types of militias? So that's the broader underlying question within the book.